The warning light on my helmet had been blinking red for 6 minutes before I stopped caring about it. That was not courage, that was just the math catching up. 6 minutes is in the zone meant 3 drones had already mapped our entry point, 2 more had logged our heat signatures, and somewhere in the dark, between the rock corridors of Corridor Cat 7, the Vorei cohesion had already assigned us a threat classification. Probably low, probably something equivalent to the word negligible. I was Staff Sergeant Moravos. I had been fighting for 9 years across 2 campaigns on 4 different planetary bodies and 1 orbital installation that no longer existed. I was 34 years old. I had a scar along my left jaw from a piece of hull plating on a ship called the Ardent, which burned in the 3rd campaign and took 60 people with it. I was not a hero. I was a person who had survived enough times that the military kept pointing me at things they wanted broken. The 8 soldiers behind me had not survived as many times as I had not. Yet Corporal Nate Jen was 28, quiet, fast with his hands, and the kind of person who always found a working power cell when nobody else could. He was my second. He moved like he was conserving something, like every step was a small investment in a future he was not entirely sure would arrive. Private Lena Dasa was 19. She had been with the 9th Breach Company for 4 months. She had bright eyes and the habit of humming very softly when she was scared, so quietly you almost could not hear it. But if you had been around her long enough, you learned to listen for it. She was humming now. The others had names and histories and small habits. 2. Sergeant Owen Cole, who had 2 daughters and kept a folded drawing. One of them had made of a horse in the inside pocket of his jacket. Private Sam O.C., who had lost the tips of 2 fingers in a training accident and always wore gloves even when nobody else did. Corporal Diana Frey, who read philosophy on her handheld between operations and had strong opinions about it. Private Aaron Marsh, who was funny in a dry, quiet way that made people laugh at unexpected moments. Private Colin Rue, who was 22 and had only been with us 3 weeks and was trying very hard not to show that he was terrified. Private Suki Ward, who could fix almost anything mechanical and had once repaired a pressure seal with a piece of wire and a bootlace. I had looked at all of them before we entered. I had memorized their faces. I do that before every operation. It is not a ritual of grief, it is a ritual of responsibility. If I remember their faces, I have to account for every one of them when it ends. The zone was not a dramatic place. That is the first thing people get wrong about it. When they hear the name, they imagine something cinematic, some vast and terrible landscape that announces its danger with visual grandeur. Corridor K7 was a stretch of asteroid belt infrastructure, tunneled rock, old mining corridors from before the war, jury-rigged relay stations, dark channels between floating rock bodies the size of city blocks. The Vorkai had moved into it because it sat at the junction of 3 human supply lines. They had fortified it over 18 months. They had turned the darkness and the narrow rock passages into a killing machine so efficient that the first 2 human units sent in had simply stopped transmitting. The 3rd unit had made it 40 hours before their signals went quiet. We were the 4th. We were not sent to fight our way through. We were sent to gather what intelligence we could before we stopped transmitting. That was the official mission. I had read it 3 times on the transport, and each time it said the same thing in different careful words. Go and see what you can see, and we understand you will probably not come back. Nobody said that last part out loud. Nobody had to. We moved in single file through the first corridor, keeping our boots off the metal grating where we could, stepping on rock instead. Vorkai drones used vibration sensors as a secondary detection system. Metal conducted vibration better than stone. That was in the intelligence brief. It was also obvious to anyone who had thought about it for 30 seconds, but intelligence briefs exist because not everyone has 30 seconds to think. The corridor was maybe 4 m wide, 3 m high, carved out of gray-brown rock that had been blasted and then smoothed over. Decades of mining, old pipe fixtures ran along the ceiling, most of them long dead, some of them repurposed by the Vorai for their own wiring. The light was almost nothing. We used no active light sources. What we had was the faint phosphorescence of the mineral deposits in the rock walls, which gave everything a dim blue-gray glow that was enough to walk by if your eyes had adjusted. My eyes had adjusted. Everyone behind me had adjusted too. That was one advantage of having spent time in the dark before. We had been moving for about 2 hours when OC touched my shoulder from behind. 2 taps, the signal for contact sound. I stopped. Everyone behind me stopped, cascading down the line with the practiced quiet of people who had trained for this exact moment. I held my breath and listened. There it was. Very faint, high-pitched humming coming from somewhere above and to the right. Drone in its patrol cycle. The hum was the sound of its sensor array doing a sweep the same way a bat sends out sound to map the dart, except this bat had weapons and was connected to a network that would respond in seconds if it found anything worth responding to. I pressed myself against the left wall. Everyone did the same. I counted in my head. The hum grew slightly louder, then held steady, then began to fade. Drone was moving away from us. We had been below its detection threshold, probably because we were moving slowly enough that our thermal signatures looked like warm rock rather than warm bodies. The hum faded. I let out my breath. DSA, 2 positions behind me, had stopped humming. That meant she was holding her breath too. I gave the signal to keep moving. We made it another hour before the corridor split into 3 branches. I pulled up the partial map on my wrist display. Partial, because the previous unit had only managed to transmit fragments before going quiet, and checked which direction had the highest probability of reaching the central relay node. The central node was the target if we could get eyes on it, maybe even access it, though intelligence value would be significant. That was the word the briefing used. Significant. I chose the middle corridor. 40 minutes later, the first shot came out of nowhere. It was not a drone. It was a station turret, a small autonomous one bolted to the ceiling at a junction point, and it had been powered down when the previous unit's map was made. It was powered up now. The shot was a rail spike, a thin metal projectile moving at high velocity, and it caught Nate Jen across the right shoulder before any of us had even registered the turret's presence. Jin did not scream. He hit the wall, got his back against it, and pressed his hand over the wound. The spike had gone through the outer layer of his suit and into the muscle, but had not hit the bone. That was luck of a very specific kind. He looked at me and gave a short Nod still moving. OC had already located the turret and destroyed it in 4 seconds with a shape charge size of his thumb. The sound it made was a sharp crack that echoed down the corridor for what felt like a very long time. The echo was the problem. Sound traveled in. Rock, the Vorai drones used sound detection as well as thermal. The crack had just painted a bright target on our position. Move, I said, and we moved. We ran for about 90 seconds through the corridor, which in the dark and in silence with a wounded man among us felt much longer than 90 seconds. Then I heard the hum again, not one drone this time but several, and they were not sweeping, they were converging. I pulled the team into a side alcove carved into the rock, probably an old equipment storage niche, barely large enough for 9 people standing pressed together. We went in. It was tight. Cole was almost nose to an SE with Rue, who was trying very hard to control his breathing. Ward had her face turned sideways because there was no space to face forward. The drone hum grew louder, passed directly overhead, and then moved further down the main corridor. They were not checking the alovs. Previous units had not used alovs. The drones had learned patterns from previous encounters and were applying those patterns. They expected human soldiers to run down corridors, not compress themselves into storage niches and stop moving. We stayed in that alcove for 22 minutes. Jen pressed his back to the rock and breathed steadily, not making a sound. OC kept his wrapped hand flat against his side. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. When the hum was completely gone, I counted to 60. Then I counted again. Then I gave the signal. We came out of the alcove. I looked at my team, 8 faces in the dim blue gray light, all of them still present, all of them still with me. Jen's shoulder was bleeding through the bandage. Frey had pressed against it in the dark, but he was standing straight. Oi flexed his wrapped hand experimentally and nodded. I thought about the 3 units that had come before us. I thought about the missions that had ended in silence. I thought about the briefing that had used the word negligible. Then I turned to face the deeper dark of the corridor ahead, where the Vorkai waited with their drones and their sensors and their certainty that nothing that had entered this place had ever given them a reason to change that certainty. All right, I said quietly, to no one in particular. Let them think we're just here to bleed. Nobody argued with that. We kept moving. We had been in the zone for 11 hours. When I realized that fighting it the way we had been trained to fight was going to finish us, the training said, maintain spacing, use cover, return fire from distance, preserve position until support arrives. The training had been written for environments where support could arrive. In Corridor Cat 7, support was not a concept that applied. The nearest human fleet element was 40 minutes away at full burn, and 40 minutes was a very long time when Vorkai drones could cross a corridor in 3 seconds. The drones were the central problem. They were fast, they were precise, and they were patient in a way that mechanical things are patient, which is to say, they did not get tired or uncertain or scared. They would wait in the dark for as long as needed. They had been calibrated for prey that moved, that ran, that tried to create distance. Distance was their preferred engagement. Range, at distance they were almost impossible to beat with the equipment we were carrying. Close was different. Close was not in their calibration. I had figured this out watching what happened when Marsh accidentally stepped around a corner directly into a drone on a patrol route. The drone was designed to engage at range at point blank distance. Its targeting system hesitated for just over a second before recalibrating. That 1 second was the gap. Marsh had used it instinctively, throwing himself sideways before the targeting resolved. He came back around the corner, breathing hard and pale, but intact. I filed that away. The second thing I had noticed was that the drones used biothermal sensors tuned for the heat signature of a living body in motion. A person standing very still read differently on those sensors than a person walking. A person lying completely flat on cold rock read differently still. The drones were not perfect. They had been built for efficiency, which meant they had been built with assumptions. One assumption was that prey in pain would panic. Another was that prey in panic would move fast and in straight lines. We were not going to do either of those things. I pulled the team into a wide equipment bay, an old mining staging area, maybe 15 m across, with rusted machinery along the walls and 3 corridor exits. I sat them down and I talked for about 4 minutes, which was the most talking I had done since we entered. I laid out what I had observed. I laid out what I thought it meant. I asked if anyone had observations to add. Ward said she had noticed that the drone seemed to navigate by a mesh of short-range signal transmitters embedded in the corridor walls. If you could disrupt those transmitters in a small area, the drones operating in that area would go briefly autonomous, still functional, but working from their last known mesh data rather than live updates. That gap would last maybe 30 seconds before they resynchronized with a nearby node. 30 seconds was workable. Cole said he had counted the patrol intervals of the 2 drones they had tracked for the past 3 hours, and they were on a 17-minute cycle, not random. 17 minutes consistent. That was a system designed for efficiency, not for adaptability. Frey said they built this for prey that operates on their assumptions. We should operate differently. That was the most useful thing anyone said, and Frey had a habit of saying useful things. We reorganized the standard formation line. Tight, minimal noise stayed, but we started using the rock walls differently. We used the old mine nooks and depressions not just as hiding spots but as staging areas. We stopped wearing our emergency position beacons entirely. I had Martian Rue take turns dragging a strip of thermal material from the equipment bay along a SID corridor to create a false heat trail that would read as a moving body on the drone sensors. It would not fool them for long, but long did not need to be very long, and we moved closer. Every decision I made pushed us deeper into the zone rather than giving us fallback options. There was a logic to this that I understood clearly, and that was also slightly terrifying to understand. The deeper we went, the more the drones were operating in their optimized patrol zones, which meant their behavior was more predictable. The edges of their territory were where they behaved most variably, most alertly. The center was where they followed their programmed routes most precisely, because the center was supposed to be safe. We were going to make the center unsafe. About 6 hours into this new approach, we hit the first real success. Ward had located a transmitter node, a small box bolted inside a section of old mining pipe junction broadcasting the mesh signal that the drones in a 200 m radius used. For navigation, she disconnected it in 45 seconds. The drones in that corridor radius slowed, swept uncertainly, and fell into autonomous mode. In that 30-second window, Cole and Marsh moved to intercept the nearest drone before it could rank. It was not a graceful operation. It was fast and close and required Cole to take the drone's impact response across his left forearm before Marsh found the access panel and killed its power. Cole's disarm was not broken. The suit had absorbed most of it. He flexed his fingers and confirmed they worked, and then he looked at the drone lying still on the rock and exhaled slowly. That was ugly, Marsh said. Ugly worked, Cole said. We moved the drone into a side alcove and covered it with loose rock. It would take the Vorkai system some time to notice. Drone was not reporting in more time than we needed right now. Lena Dasa had been watching me since we changed the approach, and I could tell she was thinking about something. She came up beside me while we were moving and spoke low. Sergeant, the drones avoid tight junctions with crossfire risk. I've seen them reroute twice now in the corridor. Geometry was wrong for clean targeting. If we pulled 3 or 4 into a tight geometry simultaneously. I looked at her. She was 19 years old with bright eyes and a slight frame, and she had just proposed what amounted to a trap, using herself as the trigger element. Walk me through it, I said. She walked me through it. It was not reckless. It was actually very precise, and it showed she had been watching the drone behavior just as carefully as I had. The plan required someone to move visibly through a junction that the drones would track, leading them into a tight corridor bend where their range-optimized targeting would be ineffective and where we would have placed charges behind them before they turned the corner. Who triggers it? I said, though I already knew what she was going to say. Me. Dasa said. I'm the fastest in the team over short distance, and I'm the smallest target profile. You understand that close means personal. I understand, she said. I thought about it for about 20 seconds, then I said yes, because the plan was sound and because Dasa had earned the right to be taken seriously. We set it up over the next 90 minutes. Rue and Osi placed the charges, rough and improvised, made from whole plating fragments and the compressed coolant canisters we had been carrying as emergency equipment. They were not sophisticated, but they did not need to be sophisticated. They needed to be directional and timed. When everything was in position, the move to the junction. She looked back once, found my eyes, and gave a single nod. Then she walked around the corner into the corridor where the 3 drones were running their patrol route. She was visible for about 4 seconds, just long enough. The drones registered her heat signature, locked, and followed. She came around the bend, moving fast and low, and hit the floor at the exact moment Rue triggered the charges. The corridor behind her was very loud for about 2 seconds, then it was quiet. Dasa came up from the floor. She was pressing one hand to the left side of her face. Fragment had caught her at the edge of her eye socket. She would lose the use of that eye for the rest of the operation, possibly longer. 2 of her ribs had been cracked by the pressure wave. She was breathing in short, careful pulls, the kind of breathing a person does when inhaling too deeply causes real pain. She had not made a sound during any of it. I went to her. She looked up at me with the one eye that was still clear and said steadily, "How many?" "All 3," Rue said from Behind us, still staring at the corridor, Dasa gave a small nod. She accepted the field bandage Frey pressed over her eye without comment. She stood up on her own. The Vorkai system had now lost 3 drones and 1 transmitter node in less than 2 hours. Somewhere in the network, that information was being processed. We had received something back from the partial intercept relay. Cole had been monitoring a fragment of transmission, not fully translated, but with enough recognizable syntax that our system could render it in approximate terms. It read unknown unit threat classification, anomaly requesting pattern analysis, not threat, not enemy, and they did not have a category for us yet. Owen Cole looked at the translation over my shoulder and said quietly, "Good, let them stay confused a little longer." He said it easily, the way he said most things, measured, unhurried, like a man who had made peace with difficulty a long time ago. He was the steadiest person I had ever served with. That steady quality was something I had relied on across 3 operations, and something I relied on now. We kept moving, always deeper. 12 hours in, we lost Cole, not to drone, not to a turret, to corridor collapse that the Vora had likely rigged as a secondary defensive measure in this section. Ceiling section that dropped when a pressure plate in the floor was triggered. It was old, simple, and invisible in the dark. Cole was walking third in line. He was the one who stepped on it. The ceiling section came down fast. He pushed roof forward out of the way as it fell. That was the kind of person Owen Cole was. He did not think about it, he just did it. I'm not going to describe what it looked like. I am going to tell you that I held his hand through the rocks while Frey checked whether there was anything we could do. There was not. I am going to tell you that he did not say much, and what he did say I have kept for myself. I am going to tell you that the folded drawing of the horse was still in his jacket pocket when we recovered what we could of him, and that I took it, and that I still have it. We stayed for 11 minutes. That was all we could afford. The ceiling collapse had made sound again, and sound was a problem. Then I got up. I looked at the 7 people still with me, who were all looking at me with faces I am not going to try to describe, and I said the only thing I could think to say that was both true and useful. He bought Rue's life. That matters. Now we go do something with it. We moved. We were bleeding, tired, and reduced. We were also further inside the zone than any human unit had ever been. The Cohesion's drones were searching for a pattern in our behavior, and they were not finding one yet, because our pattern was simply this: we did not stop, and we converted every cost we paid into a step further forward. That was not a tactic from any manual. That was something older than manuals. The Vorkai were going to find that out. We found the relay station at hour 16. It was not obvious from the outside. It looked like another junction in the rock, a slightly wider chamber with higher ceilings and additional pipework running along the walls, but the signal Ward had been tracking for the past 4 hours pointed directly to this room. And when Frey checked the power readings on her scanner, the numbers were significant enough that she showed me the display. Without saying anything, I looked at it and understood why. This was not a secondary node. This was a central coordination point, one of the primary hubs through which the Cohesion managed drone routing, sensor data aggregation, and supply coordination for the entire corridor network, it was worth more than anything we could have reasonably hoped to find. It was also guarded, 2 Vora handlers stationed inside. We could see them through the narrow gap of the partially open door, strange tall figures in environmental suits that enclosed them completely, their movements careful and precise in the way of beings who operated in a control-known space. They had 4-limbed bodies, with proportions slightly off from human, longer in the torso, shorter in the leg, with a quality of stillness when not in active motion that was almost mechanical. The suits were gray, green with markings I could not read. Their equipment was arranged around them with a neatness that suggested they had been here for a long time and expected to be here longer. They were not expecting us. The entry was fast and quiet, and I am not going to outline every moment of it except to say that one of the 2 handlers escaped through a secondary corridor exit before we could reach them, and the other did not escape. The one who did not escape stood with their back against the relay console, fully enclosed in their suit, and looked at us through the visor of their helmet with 2 large, pale, calm eyes. I looked back for a moment. Nobody moved. The handler was not fighting, was not attempting to trigger an alarm. We had cut the local transmitter node before entry, so the alarm system was running on a 30-second delay, and Rue was already at the panel working to extend that window. The handler simply stood and looked at us with those pale, steady eyes, and I had the strange and specific impression that it was doing the same thing I did before every operation. Memorizing faces, I said, "Stay still. We are not here for you." I did not know if they understood, but they stayed still. Rue got the alarm window extended to 6 minutes. Ward was at the main console working through the access structure with a speed that made me very glad she was with us. Frey took up a position at the door. Martian Dasa, who was operating on one eye, breathing carefully around her cracked ribs and refusing to sit down, covered the secondary exit. Always stood near the Vorkai handler and watched them, not with hostility, just with the same careful attention he gave to everything. The handler did something then that I was not expecting. They moved to a secondary panel on the right side of the console, slowly and with clear, deliberate movements that telegraphed they were not reaching for a weapon, and they pressed a sequence of inputs. A screen lit up in the Vorkai script, and then haltingly, line by line, it translated itself into text I could read. The translation was imperfect. Some words came through as approximations, best guesses by the translation algorithm, but the meaning was clear enough. It said, "Are you the command element of this unit?" I looked at it for a moment, then I moved to the panel and typed yes. The handler looked at the screen, then back at me. Then they typed again, "Why do you continue when continuation is not optimal?" I stood there with that question in front of me, and for a few seconds I simply read it. The room was quiet except for the sound of Ward working at the console and the faint ambient hum of stations. Power systems. My 7 remaining people were in their positions doing their jobs, and I had a wounded eye, an arm that had been nicked by a rail spike fragment 3 hours earlier and bandaged by Frey, and a tiredness in my bones that was several levels below the kind that sleep fixes, and the Vorhi cohesion through this intermediary was asking me why we kept going. I thought about the 3 units that had entered before us. And gone quiet, I thought about Cole and the folded horse drawing, I thought. About Dasa standing up from the corridor. Floor with one eye and cracked ribs in. Asking how many, I typed back slowly. Because I wanted it to be accurate. Owen, Cole, Nathan, Jen, these are names of people who bled in this corridor for ground that now belongs to us. We continue because every step we take, after every cost we pay, is a step that cannot be taken back. This place is ours. Now we have purchased it, you do not get it back. The handler read it. They stood very still for a long time. The screen stayed blank, then from a different source, not the handler's console, but from the main relay display that Ward was still working through. New text appeared, different formatting, wider margins, cleaner syntax. This was not the handler, this was something else. Accessing the translation protocol. Directly, Ward looked at it, then looked at me. That's not the local system, she said quietly. That's coming from the network. The cohesion itself was speaking. It said this unit has been reclassified, previous classification, anomaly, new classification, existential pattern request, define the boundary conditions of this behavior. Is this function of unit composition, command, structure, or species? I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. Marsh from the door said, what does it want? It wants to understand us, Frey said, not moving from her position. It cannot model us. Good, Dosa said. She was leaning against the wall, but her voice was steady. Let it try. I typed one more response. I typed it because the question deserved an answer, and because if they were going to come at us after this, I wanted them to come at us knowing exactly what they were dealing with. Species. I typed this is a function of species. The screen went blank again. For 23 seconds I counted. There was no response from the cohesion. Ward, who had been monitoring the network traffic on her side of the console, looked up after those 23 seconds with an expression I had not seen on her face before. The drone rerouting commands just stopped, she said. The ones directing units toward our position, they stopped rerouting to a different approach. I asked. No, she said. They just stopped like the whole network paused. 23 seconds of dial glance from a worked intelligence that processed millions of data points per second. That was not a pause in the human sense, in machine thought arms. That was an eternity. That was a system encountering something it could not immediately categorize and taking the equivalent of a breath. Rue had finished extracting the access data from the relay console. He pulled the storage unit and handed it to me. Everything we had come for was on it. Drone coordinates, cohesion, node architecture, supply corridor maps, patrol timing, data. The intelligence value was not significant. It was enormous. It was the kind of data that changed an entire campaign. I looked at the Vorkai handler, who was still watching us with those pale, calm eyes. You have to stay here, I told them. When the cohesion asks what we said, tell it the truth. I did not know if they understood, but they gave a slight tilt of their head that I chose to read as acknowledgement. We went to the door. Frey first, checking the corridor, then Marsh, then the others in order. I was last. I looked back at the relay station, at the screens, the equipment, the handler standing still in the center of the room, and I felt the weight of what it meant to be standing in the middle of the Vorkai's most important coordination node in corridor Cat 7. This room had directed the Destruction of 3 human units. We had walked into it with 7 people. Wounded eye, a missing hand, cracked ribs, and a dead sergeant who had pushed a young private out of the way of falling rock without a second's hesitation. I turned and followed my team into the corridor behind us. The cohesion was still not rerouting its drones. It was still doing whatever the mechanical equivalent of thinking is when you encounter something that does not fit any category you have ever built. I hoped it took its time. We needed the minutes. The eraser wave was not a name we had given it. It was a translation of the Vorai term that our intercept system rendered as close as it could in human language. The literal translation was something closer to cleansing action, total radius, but that did not fit in a field report, so the intelligence team had shortened it. Eraser wave. I heard about it the same way I heard about most things in those hours through Ward's monitoring of the network traffic, which had been running as a background task since we accessed the relay console. She was at the station exit corridor, scanner active, and she said in a very level voice, "They've authorized a Class 4 saturation." Response: I knew what a Class 4 was. I had seen the designation in briefing materials about the Vorhia's escalation structure. Class 4 was designed for fleet engagements. It was what you authorized when you wanted to fill a defined volume of space with enough fast-moving projectiles and targeted energy bursts to make continued life inside that volume a statistical impossibility. They had authorized it against 7 people, 1 of whom had one working eye, 1 of whom was missing most of a hand, 2 of whom had suffered impact injuries significant enough to slow their movement. I looked at Nate Jen, who had been walking with his right arm strapped to his chest since the rail spike hit, and who met my look with the same steady, quiet he had maintained since the first hour. "They're scared," he said. "There's something," I said. "I don't know if scared is the word they'd use." "It's the word I'd use," he said. "The wave would take time to deploy. The cohesion had to pull drone units from their current positions, reorient them, assign them to a saturation grid, and release them in coordinated sequence. That was not instantaneous. It was, by Ward's estimate from the network traffic volume, approximately 9 minutes away from full deployment. 9 minutes was not enough time to exit the zone, not in our condition, not through corridors where movement meant noise, meant additional detection. We needed a different approach. I stood in a junction corridor with 7 people who had come further into the Vorhia's home territory than any human unit in the history of this conflict, and I thought about the problem the way I thought about every problem. What do we actually have, and what can we make of it? What we had: the storage unit with the relay data, which had to get out no matter what, a partial network access window through Ward's connection to the relay station, which had not yet been severed because the cohesion had paused its normal protocols during those 23 seconds and had not fully resumed them. The Vorkai handler, we had left them behind, but the communication line to the relay console was still open in a read-only capacity. Our improvised charges reduced but not depleted. The thermal decoy strip that Martian Rue had used earlier, and which could still be reactivated for a short time, and the Vorkai drone's absolute categorical refusal to fire on their own kind. That last one was the piece that mattered The Vorkai drones were programmed with a hard override that prevented them from targeting anything broadcasting a Vorkai identification signal. This was not a tactical vulnerability the enemy would have considered significant because their operational planning there would never be a Vora identification signal in the middle of a human combat unit. That was not a thing they had designed. Against, I looked at Ward and said, the relay station, our access is still open. Read only, she said. I can't write commands, but I can pull data. Can you pull the ID broadcast format for the handler suit transponder? Ward understood immediately. Her expression shifted in the specific way it did when a technical problem became solvable. She was already at her scanner. Give me 4 minutes. 4 of our 9 were now Ward's, the other 5 were for everything else. I sent Frey and Rue to set the remaining charges, not targeting the drones this time, targeting the corridor geometry. There was a section about 60 m back where 2 corridors crossed at an angle and the ceiling was older and more fragmented than the surrounding rock. A shaped charge placed against the right support points would bring down enough ceiling to create a physical barrier that the dense drone swarm of a Class 4 saturation response could not navigate around in less than several minutes. It would not stop them. Nothing we had would stop them, but it could funnel them, slow the swarm, spread, force the cohesion to redeploy in a pattern that was not the optimized grid it had planned. Jen took the storage unit. I put it inside his jacket, strapped to his chest where his own body would shield it. He was going to move ahead to the secondary exit corridor, the one that gave the shortest route to the outer zone boundary, wherein extraction relay could pick up a transmission. If he got there, the data got out. That was the priority. I told him that plainly. He said, "What about the rest of you? We'll be right behind you," I said. He looked at me for a moment. He knew what that might mean, and I knew he knew, and we both let it sit there between us without saying anything more about it. Go, I said. Jen went. Ward had the transponder broadcast format in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She had done something extraordinary with it. She had not just extracted the format, but had found a way to overlay it on our own suit emissions using the emergency broadcast channel that every suit carried as a distress function. The resulting signal was not a perfect match for a Vorhi transponder, but it was close enough that a drone's targeting system receiving it at the same time as a standard biothermal signature would create a targeting conflict. The conflict would not last indefinitely. It would last long enough. How many suits can you push it to? I asked. 4, she said, including my own. 4 of our 7 were now broadcasting a corrupted Vorkai signature. The other 3, Marsh, Dasa, and Rue, who was back with us after placing the charges, were not. But 4 in a cluster would create enough targeting confusion for the swarm that the other 3 would benefit from. The shadow, the charges went off 60 seconds later. The corridor behind us was much louder for about 3 seconds, and then the sound of rock settling took over, a deep grinding rumble that traveled through the stone under our feet. The drone swarm hit the barrier. 2 minutes after that, we could hear it, not individual drones, but the collective sound of hundreds of them meeting an obstacle at speed, a high, strange noise that was both mechanical and somehow organic in its density. They were rerouting. Ward's scanner showed the Network traffic spiking as the cohesion recalculated. We ran not in a clean formation, we ran the way people run when they are injured and scared and aware that clean formation is a thing. For when you have the luxury of perfection, Dessau ran with one hand, covering her bandaged eye, breathing through her teeth around the ribs, but not slowing. Marsh ran without grace, but with enormous speed. Frey moved with the controlled efficiency she brought to everything. The first drones reached us. About 3 minutes in, the transponder confusion worked exactly as Ward had predicted. The lead drone slowed, swept, retargeted, slowed again. 2 of them came close, very close, within arm's length, and their targeting systems held at the edge of resolution, the corrupted signal creating a hesitation that bought us the seconds we needed to be past them. Before the hesitation resolved, it was not clean, it was not easy. Rue took a grazing impact on his left side that spun him and cracked 2 of his lower ribs, and he kept running. Ward ran directly through a targeting beam that the transponder corruption had defocused enough that it caught only the outer edge of her suit rather than center mass, and the suit held. And then we were at the secondary exit corridor, and Jen was not there. I stood at the junction and felt the tum ticking and looked down the corridor in both directions and did not see him. Marsh said he went further. He must have kept going to get more distance for the transmission. I made a decision that I did not make comfortably. I sent Frey, Rue, and Dasa ahead. I told them to move to the outer boundary. I told them the extraction relay coordinates. I told Frey she was in command if I did not catch up. Then I went back into the corridor looking for Jen. I found him 40 m back. He had made it to a wider section of corridor where the rock walls opened up into something close to a room, and he had found the relay console that the Vorkai used as a signal repeater for this section. He had accessed it. He was standing at it, one armed with the storage unit open in his left hand and a connection cable running from it to the console. He was transmitting the data. I could see the progress indicator on the call display, 64%, 6770. I could also hear the drones. They had found a way around the ceiling. Collapsed faster than I had hoped. The swarm sound was growing again, and it was coming from the direction we had come from. I went to Jen. He looked at me sideways. The indicator said 81%. You should not have come back, he said. Noted, I said. 90 seconds, maybe less. The drone sound was becoming specific. Not a general hum, but the individual pitch of close-range targeting systems. Warming up, the swarm was not far behind. Get ready to run, I said. I can't run and hold this connection, he said. The cable has to stay in. I looked at the console, at the cable, at the indicator, 88%. There is a thing that happens sometimes in very compressed moments where time seems to reorganize itself, where a second becomes something you can think inside of properly. I had that now. I thought about Jen's daughters. I thought about the storage unit and what was on it. I thought about the 72 hours that would follow if the data got through, and the campaign that would change, and the lives that would be different because of what we had done. In this corridor, 93%. I put my back against the wall beside the console. I put my body between the corridor and Jen. He did not argue. He kept his hand steady on the cable. The first drone came around the corridor bend, and I was ready for it and dealt with it the way You deal with a targeting system that is not calibrated for close range when you know where the close range gaps are. The second came 15 seconds later at 98% gen. Said done, he pulled the cable. He looked at me. I was not in good shape. I told him that plainly so we both understood the situation clearly. Can you move? He said I can move. I said we moved. I will not construct the next 11 minutes into something it was not. It was not a heroic sprint. It was two damaged people moving through a rock corridor in the dark while a mechanical swarm did its best to locate and engage them and surviving because the transponder signal was still partially active on my suit and because Jen knew the corridor geometry by memory now, after 16 hours in it, and could find the loves and the niches and the places where you could press flat into the rock and become a thing that a targeting system hesitated over. We made it to the outer boundary. Frey was there with Dasa, Marsh, Ward, and Rue, who was holding his side and breathing carefully but alive, all of them alive. The extraction relay received the transmitted data before we even reached it. Fleet Command had already begun responding to it by the time we were moving through the outer corridor toward the extraction point. The first response we received was a confirmation code. Standard protocol. The second was a message from the fleet commander that said simply received all of it. Get out now. We got out. The extraction shuttle found us at the outer boundary coordinates with a navigator who had clearly been told to push the approach speed because he came in at an angle that made Marsh mutter something under his breath about wanting to survive long enough to die in a bed. We got in. The door closed. I sat on the floor of the shuttle with my back against the hull because there was not enough energy left for chairs, and looked at the 6 people around me. Jen with his strapped arm and steady eyes, Dasa with her bandaged face and careful breathing, Ward still running checks on her scanner with mechanical focus, Marsh who had gone very quiet, Rue who was pressing his hand against his side, Frey who was looking at the floor with the expression of someone mentally checking every person against the list of who had entered. She reached the end of the list and she looked at me. I looked back. We did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying. Better. The shuttle pushed away from the corridor boundary and the zone fell behind us, still full of drones and dark, and the enormous hum of the Vorka cohesion doing whatever it was doing in those rock passages where we had spent 16 hours becoming a problem it did not have a framework for. I closed my eyes. I was very tired. I still had Owen Cole's folded drawing in my jacket pocket. Fleet Command had the data analyzed before we landed. By the time our shuttle docked with the medical frigate and the medical team came aboard with their equipment and their careful questions, the first wave of planning was already underway in the fleet operations room. Within 72 hours of that docking, the human fleet launched a coordinated assault on Corridor Cat 7 using the drone coordinates, supply line maps, and cohesion node architecture that Nate Jen had transmitted from a relay console in the middle of a Vorai saturation response while standing on one functional arm. I watched it from a gurney through a porthole. The medical frig had positioned itself at an observation angle, not intentionally. That was just where the orbit put us. Through that porthole I could see the distant light signatures of the assault, the bright quick flashes of fleet weapons finding their map targets with an accuracy that would not have been possible 48 hours ago. The corridor network that had eaten 3 human units, and that had been considered in the official assessment essentially impenetrable, it was being dismantled with the methodical efficiency that a large military force achieves when it knows exactly where to hit. Intelligence we had brought out was doing its work. I watched for a while. Then the light through the porthole shifted as the frigate moved in its orbit, and the corridor was out of view. I lay back on the gurney and looked at the ceiling of the medical bay, which was standard white and had a small inspection light blinking green in the upper left corner at precise intervals. The medical officer had come by twice. My arm was treated. My side had 2 cracked ribs that I had not been entirely aware of until she pressed on them, which had produced a response that I was not proud of, but which she said was completely expected. She was efficient and calm and asked no questions about what had happened in the zone beyond what she needed for the medical record. In the next bay, separated by a curtain, Dasa was being treated for her eye. The injury was repairable, the medical officer had told me, not fully, not back to what it had been, but workable. With the right procedure, she would retain partial vision on that side. Dasa had listened to this with the same steady quality she brought to everything and said, "When can I return to active duty?" The medical officer had looked at her for a moment and then said, "You are 19 years old." "Yes," Dasa said. "When can I return to active duty?" 3 bays down, Rue was arguing with a technician about whether he actually needed the full course of internal imaging or whether a visual assessment was sufficient. Rue lost that argument in the bay beside his. Marsh had apparently gone to sleep almost immediately after the medical team finished with him, which the nurse mentioned to me with a tone that suggested it was both unusual and entirely reasonable given the circumstances. Ward was already writing a technical report about the transponder signal manipulation. She had started it on the shuttle. I knew this because she had asked me twice during the flight for confirmation of timing details that she needed to be accurate. That was Ward. She wanted the record to be correct. Jen was in surgery. The railspike wound in his shoulder had been stable throughout the operation, but had been doing things internally that the quick field dressing had not addressed. The surgeon had found me before taking him in and said it was manageable, that the outcome was good, and then had gone back through the door. I had sat with that word manageable for a while. Frey was in the observation lounge. She had not gone to her bay yet. I found her there when I walked over, still in her suit from the zone, sitting in a chair with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the porthole. The light from the corridor assault was still visible from this angle, smaller and further now, but still present. We should have brought more people in, she said, not as a criticism, as a thought. She was working through. More people would have made more noise. I said more noise would have ended it in the first 6 hours. I know, she said. I know that's right. I just keep running the other version. That's normal, I said. Does it stop? She said. I thought about telling her something comforting. I decided she deserved accuracy more than comfort. It gets quieter, I said. She nodded slowly. She looked at the porthole a moment longer. Then she stood up and went to her bay. I went back to mine. I sat on the gurney and I took out Cole's folded drawing. I unfolded it carefully. It was a pencil drawing on paper, actual paper, which was unusual now and which told me something about one of his daughters. The one who had made it, the drawing was of a horse standing in a field. The proportions were the proportions of a child's drawing, the legs slightly too long, the head slightly too large, the grass indicated by small repeated strokes that covered the bottom third of the page. The horse was looking directly out of the picture as if it had noticed the viewer. I looked at it for a long time, then I folded it back along its original creases and put it in my jacket pocket. The week that followed was debriefs and medical appointments and the specific quiet of a military vessel when the operation is over and everyone is in the process of becoming themselves again after the version of themselves as they had been in the field. I answered questions from intelligence officers and from the fleet commander and from a documentatious team that was compiling the operational record. I answered them accurately and completely, and I asked at the end of each session that the record be specific about the names, not just unit numbers. Names, they said yes. They put the names in 3 weeks after our extraction. A Vorkai communication was intercepted and decrypted by the fleet intelligence team. It was an internal document, a report from the cohesion to the Vorai High Command Council. It described the 9th Breach Company's incursion in the zone in technical terms, with data on engagement outcomes, intelligence loss, and tactical impact. At the end of the report was a classification note. The intelligence officer who showed it to me was visibly struck by it. I could see that from the way she set the tablet down on the table between us, as if she needed a moment before she said anything. I read the classification note. It said this: species does not calculate survivability as a prerequisite for action. Observed behavior pattern involves the conversion of losses into territorial claim with no apparent decrease in operational commitment following cost escalation. Prior engagement models are insufficient. Recommend full review of all human unit threat assessments. We do not have a framework for an enemy that treats suffering as a resource. I read it twice, then I set the tablet down. The intelligence officer said that note has been shared at the highest levels of fleet command. It's being described as a turning point in how we understand what the Vorai think of us. What did they think before? I asked. She considered the question lesser persistent threat. She said that was the standard classification, and now existential pattern. She said that's what they changed it to. I thought about that existential pattern, a pattern so outside their predictive models that the best word they could put to it was existential. I thought about Cole pushing Rue out of the path of falling rock without hesitation. I thought about Dasa getting up from a corridor floor with cracked ribs and one working eye and asking how many. I thought about Jin holding the cable steady in a relay console while a drone swarm came around the corner. I thought about Ward writing a technical report on a shuttle about Marsh going to sleep the moment the medical team finished with him, about Frey running the other version in her head, the one where more people came in. Not because she was wrong, but because that is what you do when you care about the people who did not come back. That was the pattern, not tactics, not technology, not some quality of human biology or some warrior tradition or some grand civilizational purpose. Just people who kept accounting for each other even when the accounting was very costly, and who did not stop until the job was done. The cohesion could call it whatever it wanted on the day corridor. Cat 7 was officially secured by the fleet. The operations team sent me a notification informing me of the formal redesignation. The corridor was to be renamed Breach Corridor 9 in recognition of the unit that had broken it open. Within the week, the soldiers who moved through it started calling it something else. They called it the zone because it had been that before we got there, and it was that still, and the name carried the weight of what it had cost, and names that carry weight deserve to be kept. I heard about the new name from Jen, who was out of surgery and healing, who heard it from Rue, who had heard it from someone in the assault force who had been through the corridor and had asked a passing sergeant what it was called. Jen told me in the medical bay, sitting in the chair beside my gurney, his arm in a proper stabilizer now. Instead of the field strap, I was in that same bay because I had gone back to it every day since we landed, not because I was still being treated, because it was the place I had been when the first wave of the assault lit up through the porthole, and because something about being there felt right. Until everything was fully finished, I listened to him tell me about the name. Then I looked out the porthole, which was showing a space now, the corridor behind us, and the fleet moving forward. I thought about what the zone had been before we entered it. I thought about the 3 units who had gone quiet. I thought about what it was now. I thought about the names I had written on the wall of the hospital bay on the first night with a stylus, because there was nothing else to write on. Cole Jen's name I had written by mistake and then corrected when he walked in the next morning. 2 others the wall still had the marks I had checked before I left the bay for the last time. Nobody had painted over them. I was 34 years old. I had a scar along my left jaw and cracked ribs healing, and an arm that was mostly right again, and a folded piece of paper. In my jacket pocket, I had names I carried. I had ground that we had paid for with those names, and ground that is paid for that way does not go back. That is not sentiment. That is simply how it works. You pay for something with enough of yourself. It belongs to you in a way that no reclassification, no counteroffensive, no cohesion decision can fully undo. They had tried to erase us. They had sent their largest tactical response against 7 people, and the 7 of us had used their own navigation signals, their own drone protocols, their own structural vulnerabilities against them, and we had gotten the data out, and the fleet had done the rest. This is what I want to say about all of it, not the strategy, not the military significance, not the cohesion's internal documents with their careful, frightened language about existential patterns. This Owen Cole had a daughter who drew horses on paper. Nate Jen held a cable steady with one arm. Lena Dasa stood up from a corridor floor and asked how many. Suki Ward was writing a technical report before we even landed. Samosi kept his hand pressed flat and did not make a sound. Diana Frey ran the other version in her head because she cared enough to. Aaron Marsh went asleep when the job was done, which is the thing you do when you have been awake long enough. Colin Rue, who had been with us 3 weeks and had been terrified and had stayed and had run and had placed charges in the dark and had come out the other side. They should not have tried that, not because we do not hurt, not because we cannot be Stopped, but because when we bleed for a piece of ground, we remember it. We put names on the walls of small rooms. We keep folded drawings in our jacket pockets. We call a corridor by the name it had when we suffered for it, because that name belongs to the suffering, and the suffering belongs to us, and we do not let go. They did not have a framework for that. I hope they spent a long time trying to build